Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the moves by a business in Kent to do the government's job for it in setting up post-Brexit inspection facilities to carry out checks so that they can actually manage a feasible level of trade with the EU. But first, for daily political commentary, please click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So when it comes to traders navigating import control since Brexit, there was an article in the FT which relates a number of concerns about the state-run facility at Sevington, which has attracted complaints ever since it opened in, I think it's 2022. Earlier this year, Dover Port Authority was saying Sevington was never designed to cope with the level of import checks needed after Brexit, which begs the question, of course, what was designed to cope? Answer came there none, because the Tories put all their efforts into finding a political way to leave the EU under the harshest terms possible to keep the swivel-eyed loons on side, but no effort at all into working out how to actually cope afterwards. The facility at Sevington has never seen very much use because it just doesn't seem to be able to do much. And yet when trucks are sent there, they'll often be delayed for a full day or more. The fact that it was over 20 miles inland also drew criticism because it means a longer journey for the vast majority of honest hauliers sent there, but a relatively easy way to evade the checks for fraudsters. Like there's plenty of scope for having an illicit load dropped off on the way, for example. And that's just the problem with the basic concept of Sevington. There are also day-to-day problems, IT systems not working properly, the trusted trader scheme not having been properly implemented yet. And this is what we've been seeing in the years since Brexit. There's multiple levels of fail. Leaving the EU means we don't get to decide the rules and agreements governing what will always be our most important market. They go, we'll decide our own rules. Yeah, that's great, but we don't trade. We can't just trade with ourselves. We have to trade with other people. We don't decide their rules. We used to in the EU. We used to. Not anymore. Then there's the next level. And we'll leave the single market and customs union while we're at it. Okay, so great. So now not only do we lose our say with the most important market, we also lose our easy access to it as well. Brilliant. But even beyond that, we've created extra frictions, ones that didn't have to exist, by just not having the systems in place to cope with the consequences of those decisions. We literally built nothing before we left the EU, or at least before it had, well, yeah, actually, before we left the EU, we had nothing, did we? The first thing to pop up were the Kent lorry parks, weren't they? On the quiet, the people of Kent were going, hey, what's going on here? Oh, we need these lorry parks, you see. What for? For Brexit? I thought you said it wouldn't make any difference. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we lied. You know, so it means that Brexit is harming our trade more than it strictly had to. Because, like, the EU spent years, Britain's wanting to leave, so we're going to have to build up these facilities. We didn't, because the government wanted to give the impression that nothing much would change, except we'd magically get all these benefits. So even given the harsh nature of the Brexit the Tories insisted on, it was made much worse. It's meant that some trade is impossible. Businesses have just had to abandon exporting across the Brexit border in either direction because it's too expensive or too much hassle, or both. So Provender Nurseries, which they trade in plants, of course, in Kent, they set up their own facility to carry out the checks. Now, as the article states, they have to use government inspectors because, this trusted trader scheme has not been set up properly yet. But by providing the facilities themselves, they can cut costs. The common user charge, which has been getting a lot of stick, can't help that a lot of hauliers have to pay this charge. And it's supposedly to cover the cost of checks. But checks are really essentially not happening very much. So even though we have in theory now rolled these out this year. So hauliers are getting hammered with these checks, these service charge, sorry. There's hardly any checks going on. And when they do, sometimes you get lorries that are, can you go over there for a check? And they wait for a few hours and they come, yeah, sorry, we haven't got the staff to check. You'd have to go now. So they just wasted hours and paid money for it. And it'll be interesting to see some journalists properly press Labour now on how they see this mess that they're in government. Because we know that Starmer is desperate for three main agreements with the EU. A veterinary agreement in order to reduce the overall level of checks taking place, a mutual recognition of qualifications, and an easier way of allowing performers to work in each other's market. Now, It's not clear how valuable the EU Commission sees those agreements, but they're almost certainly not as interested in them as the UK government is. So in order to seriously pursue these, Labour needs three things, three ducks in a row. The first is just to get talking with the EU. I've talked about this recently. We basically need a sort of gateway drug of sorts to get the ball rolling before getting to the hard stuff. Labour had initially talked about an informal security agreement. David Lammy was quite clear. He just wanted to get some talks going. He didn't really care about the strength of the agreement. Just get something going so we can have those talks. But maybe the youth mobility scheme is the way to go. But as soon as we can get talking on one agreement formally, we can talk about others informally once people are in the same room. Second, we need to show that we can meet our obligations, a good faith and competence check. The EU Commission have already said they're not interested in discussing any new agreements until we've implemented our previous ones. Now, as I said at the time, that's probably not strictly true. We now know it's not strictly true because they are eager to discuss youth mobility in Erasmus. But it is true that very complex agreements are going nowhere until we show that we're prepared and able to implement them. That means, remember, we haven't actually implemented our 2020 agreement yet. It's years later. So think about it this way. Why would the EU embark on complex negotiations for a much tougher agreement if we can't show that we've complied with our 2020 agreement? So we need to get that going. But the third is motivation. We need to motivate the EU into seeing the advantages to themselves of the same agreements Labour want for the UK. They're not going to do anything for us, for just because they feel sorry for us. And this is tricky at the moment because the EU apply full import controls on our exports to them. But we are applying very, very light touch to EU exports to us. It's very one-sided. The more we ramp up our import controls, the more it hurts EU businesses and the more advantage there will be for the EU to go, okay, well, there's benefit for us in lowering trade barriers. So if Labour want their agreements, as well as agreeing to discuss the low-hanging fruit first and getting the Northern Ireland Protocol implemented, they're also going to need to make sure that we have the systems in place to manage checks on incoming goods, at least as much as we can. It's impossible to ramp up import controls to match those by the EU. It was probably never feasible, but we're too many years behind as well. But not all businesses can afford to just set up their own inspection facilities like this nursery in Kent. It cost them £80,000. And think about this. So they spent that £80,000 because it works out way cheaper than relying on the government provided facilities, which, by the way, cost £0 when we're in the EU. So imagine how much those traders having to use the government facilities because they can't afford their own. Imagine how much they're being financially screwed over, and then how much they're having to increase their own prices for the British market to be able to afford it. The government does need to get a grip on this because this is the leverage we really need for future EU talks. We also need it because, we need to allow British businesses to actually trade. But ultimately, we need it for that leverage. Starmer's attempts to downplay his interest in youth mobility and Erasmus, if that is why he was doing it, that seems to have backfired. His entire reset strategy is currently stalled. He would do better to engage in talks on the obviously mutually beneficial agreements, get officials talking to one another about the pathway to future agreements, and in the meantime, get to work fixing the real problems with our border control. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.